Hello, good morning. I am Professor R.K. Saxena, and I shall be giving you three talks in the series Science and Society. This series itself is actually the course on Introduction to South Asia, which every student of SAU has to take. And our department, the Biotechnology department, gives this course as a Science and Society series of lectures. Now, my portion of this particular course would try to cover the phenomenon of the human phenomenon itself. We'll start right from how the universe was created, then how the life and then how the earth was created, and how did life started on the earth, and we'll discuss a bit about the evolution process whereby different life forms, including humans, evolved on the earth. And then we will talk about when did the society formed in South Asia. We'll see it in the perspective of time, that when relatively all these things happen, you should always keep in mind that many of these things we are not very sure about, but I'll be telling you what is our current ideas. These concepts might change, but we have a fair amount of certainty about many of these concepts that I'll be discussing with you. In the second lecture, we'll confine ourselves to the evolution of the society in the perspective of science and intellectual activities in South Asia. Okay? And then in the third lecture, we'll talk about how did the science progress? What were the constraints? And when did what happen? And how come now we are in a world where the science is so important? And what problems this science has created, we'll also discuss that. There are so many problems that have come along with the comforts that science has given us, but it has also given us lots of problems. And we are going to discuss that. And then in the final part of that lecture, we'll talk about the future, that what is the future of humanity. So I think let's start with the first talk, and I'll start the share screen. So I hope you can see the very first slide. It just says Science and Society, Origin of the Universe, Earth, Life, and Humans. So let's start discussing this in sequence. Now, the very first thing that we'll talk about is the very basic question which all societies, all human beings ask themselves. Who made this universe? Who made the life? Who made the human beings and all that? And there are some very interesting thoughts about that, which many societies, and you see, we don't have time to go into details and all, but I have just presented to you some of these thoughts. In fact, because you will have these lectures in recorded form, you can always go back to the slide and read them, because we may or may not have time to actually read everything. But let me start reading by what Greeks thought. And you know, Greeks were there about 2,500 years ago. And what have they said about who created the earth, who made the universe? So here it is. In the beginning, there was a period of chaos when air, water, and matter were combined in a formless mixture. On this floated a cosmic egg, from which there arose Gaia, which is their word for earth, and Uranus, their word for sky. These deities created the earth and its creatures, and the sun, moon, and the stars. So, if you ask, what is the basis of this thinking? We don't know. This is what the records they have left. This was their thought. This was their inspiration. Similarly, you can go through what is the thought of the Algerian tribe, or what do Chinese say about it, and what Christians said about is very interesting. They have in the Bible, they have a very definite answer to when the earth was created. And I am just reading from there. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, which occurred at the beginning of the night, which preceded the 23rd of October in the year 4004 BC. And this is a Christian Bishop James Usher, who said this. This has become a very popular quote nowadays. And so they had such a definite idea that they know that the universe was exactly made about 6,000 years ago. Again, there are thoughts from Apache Indians, or Buddhism actually doesn't discuss these kind of things, and they say origin of the world is unconjecturable. It is not to be conjectured about, as that would bring madness and vexation to anyone who does it. So this is kind of a taboo in Buddhism to talk about these things. In India, we have also many ideas that are there in our ancient scriptures. And I would actually confine myself to Bhagwat Gita, because they have very clear enunciation of the idea of universe and who created it. And you can see here, Gita, as many of you would know, is a part of the epic, the grand epic Mahabharata. And in Gita, which is a distillate of the wisdom at that time, was recited by Lord Krishna to the warrior Arjuna. We will not go into the story here. You can always read about it. But in this particular book, Bhagavad Gita, and Bhagavad Gita has 700 shlokas, verses, 700 verses. And there are 5 specific verses. They give you a very precise answer to this question. And these verses are in chapter 8, verse 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22. So you have actually 6 verses here, which, I translated Gita into Hindi verses. And these Hindi verses have been taken from this particular book here, Geeta Kavya Madhuri, and Baal Gita, which is a subsequent book published by Penguin. But let us just go through this concept, because this is very interesting and very precise. And let me at least read one of the verses here, though some of you may not know Hindi, but the English translation is also here. You can read. इस सकल सृष्टि के प्रकटन को तू दिवस ब्रह्म का समझ पात, फिर विलय सृष्टि जब होती है वह रात्रि ब्रह्म की है यथार्थ. Consider the creation of this universe as a day of Brahm, and its dissolution is the night of Brahm. So the concept is that Brahm is the ultimate truth of this universe. And we talk about the creation and dissolution of the creation in forms of the day of Brahma and the night of Brahma. Okay? So the creation process goes on for thousands of yugas. and night of dissolution is equally long. So the idea here is that there is a entity, Brahma, which is the ultimate truth. From there, the universe arises, and into that the universe dissolves. And this process of creation and dissolution is a cyclic process which goes on. So there is no beginning and there is no end. Okay, and here in this particular verse, it is said that the creation process takes thousands of yugas. You see, and then yugas have been defined in the Indian scripture, the ancient scripture, and thousands of yugas would be something like few billion years. And this scale of time fits very well with what the modern science knows about the creation of universe. So let's just quickly go through. When the day of Brahma starts, the whole universe emerges from the basic Brahma. During the night of dissolution, it dissolves back into Brahma. Thus the universe gets created and dissolved repeatedly in this manner. Basic essence of this visible universe is thus Brahma. So what we see around us is a creation which is something which is created out of Brahma. It's not Brahma. And when the universe dissolves, then it will go dissolve back into Brahma. And then Lord Krishna says the Brahma actually is my eternal abode, which actually gives a hint that the ultimate truth, the universal God, is what this Brahma is. And those who understand this truth gets liberated from the cycles of rebirth. So essentially what Geeta says, that creation of universe and its destruction are cyclic process which keep on happening, and it's not something that has a beginning or has an end. It is eternal. The Brahma is eternal, and universes in sequence come and get dissolved. Okay. Now, what is the modern science thinking about the creation of universe? And you may all have read about the theory of Big Bang. And according to this theory, universe started with a Big Bang, which happened about 14 billion years ago. Okay. So now here here we are showing the Big Bang as this spot. From there, this is a time scale here. The universe is emerging, flowering out of the Big Bang. Okay. And right now, 13.7 billion years have passed since the Big Bang occurred. And this is where, initially it is all gaseous matter, and they slowly condense into different planets, okay, and stars and what have you, including Earth. And this process is going on. And Earth was created about 4 billion years ago. Okay. So before Earth was created, the Big Bang, still there were about 8 billion years had passed before Earth was created. The formation of Earth and the solar system is about 4.6 billion years ago, and keep this an important figure. So 13.7 billion years ago, you had the Big Bang, and Earth came into being. Earth and our planetary systems, our Sun and Mars and Venus, what have you, 4.6 billion years ago. Now the question arises that on this Earth, when the Earth was created, it was very, very hot, and then it condensed into a solid mass. Okay. How could life occur? How could life evolve on this Earth? Obviously, there was no life when the Earth was created, and that happened 4.6 billion years ago. And this is a constant question, that where did the life come from? And this is a very important and very interesting experiment which was done by Stanley Miller in 1952. Their hypothesis was that let us recreate the situation, the conditions that were there on the earth, and let's see if you can create the life out of these conditions. So they took the gases which they think, there is evidence that there were gases like methane, ammonia, and you have the carbon dioxide and water. All this, the atmosphere of the earth at that time had no oxygen, but it has all these gases. And so this equipment, what happens in this equipment? They are boiling the water here. The steam is going like this, and it comes, and you have this moist atmosphere with all these gases. And then they pass electrical sparks to mimic the lightning, which they think would have been there. And then this condenses, water condenses again, and goes back here. So this reflexive process goes on. And what they found that they actually did it for about a week. And what they found that initially there was a very clear liquid. But by the end of a week, the liquid has become brown and it had become turbid. And then they analyzed the content of this liquid. So let's read here. At the end of 1 week of continuous operation, Miller observed that as much as 10 to 15% of the carbon within the system was now in the form of organic compounds. So carbon was here in form of methane and carbon dioxide. So these guys got converted into those chemicals which are very, very essential for life, like amino acids, which make the proteins in the living cells. And so what they found that in this mixture, all these chemical compounds which are required for a living system evolved. So what is the idea here? Idea here is under the conditions that prevailed on Earth in the beginning, gradually these chemicals which are required for the life process, they emerged out of the processes that were going on the Earth. Earth was very hot. So you can imagine the steam and you can imagine the lightning. So eventually, all these chemicals, sugars, lipids, and the building blocks for the nucleic acids were also formed. So now we understand that how these building blocks were formed. But from these building blocks, how did the life itself emerge is something we don't know. But over millions of years, it so happened that very tiny life forms appeared. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see here. No, so very tiny single cellular life forms evolved. And then it took millions and billions of years that these tiny primitive life forms then evolved into higher organisms, animals and plants. And we are going to talk about it. What is the principle behind this evolution? And that principle was first given by this great man here, Charles Darwin. I'm sure you must have heard about Charles Darwin. He was born about 200 years ago in England, and he studied in Cambridge. And he was 22 years old when he finished his education. And then there was a ship with the name of Beagle. This ship was going to go around the world for many kind of studies. And he was asked to join the staff of this ship Beagle to study various life forms that occur in different parts of the world. And the Beagle went around the earth and it took 5 years, 1831 to 36. And Charles Darwin was only 22 years when he joined it, and when he returned, he was 27 years. And in between, wherever the ship went, Charles Darwin collected the biological specimen, shipped them back to his original institute in England. Then he came back and he contemplated for a very long time, tried to distill all the wisdom that he got from various samples that he had collected, his own observations around the world. And in 1859, that is when he was 50 years old, he wrote this book, which is a classic now, The Origin of Species, that how did different species of plant and human and animal species evolved on the earth. And Darwin died in 1882. Let's look at this trip. Darwin left England in 1831, and this is England, and his trip went like this. You know, you have the Earth map, the world map here. They moved like this, went around South America. And then this place, which is Galapagos Islands, which is very important, which has played a very important role in his thinking. And then the beagle went, is the picture of beagle here. And then arriving, you look to the other side of the hemisphere, went to Australia, and then, traveled like this around in Mauritius here, around Africa, and finally went back to England. So this whole trip took 5 years. Okay. And you can imagine, Beagle was not a very big ship. It was only about 200 feet long ship. And all these people who were living on Beagle lived in very tiny rooms, 10 feet by 10 feet, shared by 3 people. And in this only, Darwin did all his thinking, collected all the specimens. Whenever he came to the land, he shipped them, and then keep making his notes. And he actually had a huge amount of notes that he prepared during this trip. That was his food of thought for next several decades, till when he was 50 years old, he wrote The Origin of Species. I'll just give one example, and I told you Galapagos Islands played an important role, and these Galapagos Islands are on the west side of Ecuador. It's a part of the Ecuador even today. You can take a flight, go to Galapagos Islands and come back. Because of Darwin's work, these islands are very famous now. What essentially Darwin found, he had a very keen sense of observation. And he found that, and we don't have much time to discuss in details, but essentially what he found was that the birds that he observed in different islands had their beaks, we call them finches. Finches are these birds. And in different islands, they have different types of beaks. And when he contemplated, he could relate the shape of the beak with the kind of food stuff which is available on that island. Okay, so Darwin wondered about the changes in the shape of birds' beak from island to island. The so-called cactus finches boast longer, more pointed beaks than their relatives, that the ground finches, beaks of warbler finches are thinner and more pointed. You see, he had a very keen sense of observation, and he thought about it. How come that these birds have different shapes of the beaks? And he finally proposed that these beaks are adaptation made, and that make them more fit to survive on the available food. So it depends upon what food was available on the island. They evolved the appropriate type of beak. And that was the thinking behind the process of evolution. So this is the theory that he gave, the concept evolution by natural selection. And what does that say? That there is a struggle for existence by the various animal species. They compete for food, mates, space, water, etc. And then those individuals of the species who are fittest, who would survive under those conditions, those only will survive, and the other members of the species would perish. Therefore, there is a kind of a pressure exerted on what kind of animals would survive in that particular species. Okay, so from the same pool, the subsequent generations of the species would have modifications like the beaks, which made them more adapt to survive under the conditions that were available. I think let's understand a little bit more about the mechanism of evolution. You know, I told you the life evolved as single cell life forms, very tiny life forms which you can only see under microscope. So those are called unicellular life forms. And later on, when bigger organisms grew, then there was aggregation of these cells, and large animals and large plants are actually aggregate of a variety of these cells that we have. Thus, in a human being, we have about 30 to 40 trillion cells in an adult human being. So many cells are there, and there are different types of cells. There are cells that make up your liver, your lung, your intestine, your heart. They are all different kind of cells, but there is a common thought behind, there's common mechanism or behind. And all these cells are actually living cells. Okay? They all living cells. And what happens in a given cell, I'll just very briefly discuss. You would have studied it in your school biology, but the master molecule in a cell is called the DNA. And DNA has a code, which is the code for life, because that code is required for cell to know what kind of product it has to make, what kind of proteins it has to synthesize, and all those things. So RNA gets transcribed into DNA gets transcribed into RNA, which is a very similar molecule. DNA is a double-stranded molecule, polymer, whereas RNA is a single strand molecule. This is the RNA here. And RNA then forms the script to make proteins, and that process is called translation. So all the proteins that are required in a cell to make its membrane and all the organelles inside, all those proteins are made from the code that is contained in the DNA. Okay? Now, if that code changes, then you would understand the protein that it forms will also change a little bit. So here we show a code which is TAACTGCAGGT. The code is in form of 4 letters, four entities, nucleotides. Let's not go into details of that. But this sequence is what is important. And that sequence is direct. The DNA will direct what kind of proteins the cell will make. Now suppose here this T changes into C. That is called a mutation. It's a point mutation. Now these point mutations can occur in a cell spontaneously. Okay. Now what will be the result? The result would be that it may make a protein which is slightly different from what was originally made. Okay. So it is possible that because this is a defective protein, the cell may not survive and die. But it is also possible that this change that you have made makes a protein that makes the cell even better adapted, better survival. Okay. Let's look at it in this way. Suppose this is a life form. This is a colony of living beings. The colony is increasing in size. They are dividing. Okay. This is a larger colony here now. Now within this colony, some of the individuals will have mutations, which are shown here. They are slightly different from the main organisms. You have many mutations that you see here. Now it is possible that some of these mutations are better for the survival of the cell, the survival of the colony. So this particular mutant individual will further the colony. Okay, the main colony that you had would slowly perish, and these ones which are better suited would actually proliferate more, and this will be uh, the origin of a new life form, which is slightly different from the original life form that you had. Okay. So what are the crucial factors in the biological evolution? So we say that there are a large number of progeny. So the colony is forming, there are a large number of individuals. And there are mechanisms to introduce minuscule variations in individuals in the progeny because of point mutations. And some of those will survive, would be better survivors. Okay. And then the life form will change slightly. Okay. Of course, what is really required here is the instinct to survival, that all life forms, there is an inherent instinct to survive. Okay. The only thing is that the one which is more fitter will override the others and will survive better. Yes. Okay. So how did evolution happen on Earth? If you just give me a moment, I'll get a glass of water and come back. So you see here, life actually, as I told you, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And the very first life forms occurred 3.5 billion years before. So when Earth was formed, after that, for 1 billion years, nothing happened. And what is a billion? It is actually 100 crores. So 100 crore years, nothing happened. And then about 3,500 million years ago, the very first life form evolved, which were, as I told you, unicellular. And then from there, the process of evolution took place. As Darwin has suggested, you got more complicated life forms. The plants came into beings, larger animals, okay, and finally the human beings. So we can say here, the earliest life occurred on the Earth about 3,500 million years ago. The plants only evolved about 500 million years. So for about 300 million years, there were no plants. Only these very, very tiny unicellular life forms, simpler life forms. And then plants evolved about 500 million years ago. Dinosaurs were there 230 million years ago. And the very first hominids. What are hominids? Hominids belong to the family of these very late human-like erect standing apes, which are the forefathers of the present-day human beings. They only occurred on the Earth about 3 to 4 million years ago. And then finally humans, which is a species within these hominids, and we call ourselves Homo sapiens. We came on this Earth only about 0.1 million years ago. Only about 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens came, and within this short span of time, we have totally conquered the Earth, and we are doing all that that you see around yourself. It is interesting to compare the time scales. Now, if all this evolution that you see here is compressed into 1 year, if the evolution of Earth, if the evolution of life on Earth is considered to be over a period of 1 year, then humans are in the existence for only 1.5 minutes. So you can see that we are here very, very recently. the life was there for thousands of millions of years before that, and then came the humans. Let's look a little bit about the evolution of the human beings. The very first hominids that we had, Australopithecus afarensis is a popular name that we know, they occurred about 3.5 million years ago. Okay, for the first 99.92% of the time of Earth existence, there were no humans. They were there only for the last 0.08% of the time. Okay, and then you have so many species of hominids that you see here, the time scale you see here. Now here is today, and this is 1 million years ago, 2 million years, 3, 4. And all these are different species of hominids that arose and vanished. So for example, A. afarensis arose around this time, about 3.7 million years ago, and vanished by about 2.8 or 2.9 million years ago. So we come to know about these dates by by archaeology and by dating the samples and by the fossil records and all that. We'll talk a little bit about that. So what is important here to note that different hominids came and then vanished, you see. And the first first species of the Homo series started here, you see. Homo rudolfensis, it is arose about 2.5 million years ago and then vanished about 1.7 million years ago. Then Homo habilis, another Homo erectus here, survived for a relatively more time. The last species that we had, which was very similar to our own Homo sapiens, was actually Homo Neanderthals. Neanderthals was a species which was there. We call where the Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted. And it's only about 40, 50,000 years ago that Neanderthals finally got extinct. And now the only species that you have, only hominids you have, is the Homo sapiens. That is what we are. And that, as I told you, is in existence for only about 100,000 years, 200 to 100,000 years ago. This is also another depiction from the hominin ancestors. How did different hominins evolve? And finally, you have the Homo sapiens. And we had just left behind Homo neanderthals that got extinct about 40 to 50,000 years ago. Now, all this initial development of hominins took place in Africa. You see here the red. This is the area where the forefathers of human beings first arose. And from there, it is believed they migrated to the rest of the earth. And you see, 200,000 this is the time, 200,000 years ago. And then they started migrating. They reached Europe about 40,000 years ago. And they migrated eastwards. They came to India, South Asia, about 70,000 years ago. Okay. And from here, they moved to Central Asia. And then from here, they moved to the Far East. They went to Australia about 50,000 years ago. And then, finally to New Zealand here only very recently. Now, what you should remember, you may wonder that how did they go through the sea, etc. You see, there were ice ages where the sea level had gone down by almost 100 meters. So many of for example, this Bering Strait that you see here, which joins the Russia from Alaska, it's now there is sea here, but when the water was 100 meters below the level, then there was a landmass, a land bridge. And these hominins could cross and move to America about 12,000 years ago. and then finally to South America. So what is, in a sense, we are seeing here, that they originated from Africa and then slowly, gradually spread out throughout the earth. Let's read here. Homo sapiens, the first modern humans, evolved from their early hominid predecessors between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. They developed a capacity for language about 50,000 years ago. The first modern human being moving outside of Africa started about 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. Okay, so this is in a nutshell. If we recapitulate, Big Bang was 13.7 billion years ago. Earth was formed, Earth and all the planets in the solar system evolved around 4.5 billion years ago. Life evolved on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. And that it gradually evolved into higher life forms. The process we have discussed a little bit, the hypothesis, the theory of evolution, the natural selection process and survival of the fittest. And gradually human beings came into beings very, very recently. And then they have migrated to different parts of the world. Now, what is important here is to note one thing, that if you look at the human brain, you find it is covered by this huge lobe, which is called Neo-cortex. Neo-cortex. Neo means new cortex. And if you see in lower animal forms, it is there in a very small amount. For example, in monkeys, it is developed a bit. And humans, it has really, really hugely developed. Okay. So if you look at the brain of the higher animals, it's a common kind of a structure. You have this red looking area, which is called limbic system, which all animals have. And this is the site where all the emotions and instincts lie. So emotions and instincts are there in the limbic system. That limbic system of the brain is responsible for the emotions and the instincts, the animal instincts. And neocortex evolved later on, and it has evolved rather quickly in humans. And neocortex is the part of the brain that is required for more complex things like thinking, like language, like contemplation, like planning. So all this is neocortex. And if you see the development of neocortex in humans, in the hominids, you see here the curve. How did the brain size increase from primates to the early hominids and finally to human beings? And right now, the brain is about 1.5 kg in Homo sapiens. And this has really evolved very rapidly over last 100,000, 200,000 years. And that brain with huge neocortex has given us the ability to think and be and plan and do all that humans do. So the language, the ability to speak and have a language, this evolved about 50,000 years ago. Okay. Now humans are the only life form that contemplates. And language is necessary for contemplation. This is something you should keep in mind. We can only think when we have a language. If certain words are not known, you can't think about them. So in order to refine your thinking, the language itself has to be refined. So initially there was a very crude language, okay, as you say here. A vocabulary of few hundred words is sufficient for daily life. There are many tribes, human tribes, primitive tribes, that have a very small vocabulary, and that suffices for them. They can do their day-to-day work, affairs, or that vocabulary is sufficient for them. But if you want more sophisticated thought, you require more extensive vocabulary. So what happens? Once you have language, you can have thoughts and you can contemplate. And the more you contemplate, you refine your language more new words are added, and then gradually, this is a kind of a circle that the language feeds on itself and becomes more and more complicated. And now we have the present modern languages like English, which may have millions of words. Okay? And we can talk about nuances. We can convey the ideas, all that because we have a very sophisticated language. Now, what is important to note here is that the presence of neocortex does not ensure that a mind also exists. So brain is just an instrument. How it is trained is important. Otherwise, you won't have all those neocortical functions. They will be, and you take the example of the so-called feral children. Who are feral children? Feral children are those human babies who for some reasons were left in wild without a contact with humans, and they were raised by animals. So these children, their brain is like a human brain. They have the same amount of neocortex. Nonetheless, there is no spark. They are just like animals. They don't have language. They can't think. So the point here is the existence of a neocortex does not mean that the thoughts will follow. For that, you require a upbringing, a human upbringing, and that is very important. You see here, when an animal gives birth to a litter, then how do these litter, these offsprings, how do they learn about the life? They learn it only by genes and instincts, because mother and father would transfer their genes into these animals, and they will have that limbic system that I talked about, and they will have all the instincts that are required for survival. They would require the instinct for survival, the flight and fight reactions that you have, how to search for food, how to search for mate, how to procreate. All these are inbuilt into the genes and instincts, and all animals have them, and they inherit from their parents. In humans also, we have the transfer of genes and instincts. But what is more important in humans is that we transfer to our offsprings cumulative knowledge. And that can only be possible once you have the language. Now we can print books, we have computers, we have all those things. We have a very refined language. So that is the process of education. Sometimes when I ask students, what is the purpose of education? Sometimes you hear answers like, sir, because we want to have a career. We want to go into a particular profession, so we want to be educated. But really understand this. Education actually is the process of transfer of cumulative knowledge of the human beings accumulated over thousands of years into the next generation. And that cumulative knowledge is very important, and that makes us different from animals. So we have then that very refined language, very refined thought process, the written word, the oral, the text, the verses, all these things. We'll talk more about it later, but let's just now look at overall picture here. Now we are just looking at this time scale, which is from today. This is 0 means now, 10,000 years ago, 20,000, 30, 40, 50,000. So this is a time scale, this is a time scale. The language evolved around this time. Okay. They started to say sentences. They started to communicate with the fellow human beings, okay, about 50,000 years ago. And you see here Neanderthals extinct at about 45,000 years ago. Now we have only Homo sapiens that are on the earth. Now we have our known history goes back only by maybe about 5,000, 6,000 BC. But really, if you want to think of this, from this point, we also know that agriculture started around, what, about 12,000, 13,000 years ago. Okay? That is the origin. But before that, humans survived. They were hunter and gatherers. They were talking to each other. They were evolving their language. They were not writing it, but the thought was evolving. So now what I want you to understand, that all this from 50,000 years ago, when the language arose, right till this period, when we started writing, there is a big, huge black box. Very difficult to know how actually this process took place. How did we actually evolve during this period? This is quite a black box for us. Now, that doesn't mean that humans were not acting like humans in that time. For example, this is a very interesting case here. Is a statue which was, it dated back to 25,000 years ago. So that is about here in the black box. There was no written record, no nothing. But this statue, of course, was made by humans. Very refined statue, 1.5 inches. This was has been carved out of ivory from mammoth. And it is dated 25,000 years old. And similarly, you have this case here, a skeleton that was found in Russia. And this is dated to be about 28,000 years ago. And this skeleton was covered with draperies of ivory beads, necklace, pendants. And it is estimated it is 10,000 man-hour work. Obviously a royal person, a royal lady maybe, that occurred about 28,000 years ago. So this is not a part of the written history. But I think you should not go with the idea that whatever humans did, they started doing from only when we had the written history. There was a huge time lapse here, time scale, 50,000 years, where we do not know what actually was happening. But one thing we are sure, the human culture was developing, human thought was developing all this time. Okay? And gradually, probably we'll find more about this black box that we have. Okay, so we stop here for this first talk, where we have, if I recapitulate, we started with the origin of the universe, and we have now seen how humans evolved, and that how what is more important for us is that black box of 50,000 years that we have, where intelligence was there. There were intelligent human beings with well-formed language. Only there are no records of that period. Okay. So we will continue in the next talk that I'll have with you, where we will specifically talk about how did the society develop in South Asia, which is essentially India. Okay, and we'll talk about why India is actually South Asia, because that time there were no different countries, only the landmass. Okay, so thank you. We'll meet again for the next class.